Now, my opinion, in the realm of wood turning as an art form, I believe box making is just the ultimate pinnacle. Now, I will always tell people, the first thing you need to really get good at in wood turning is spindle turning, stuff between centers, because that will teach you the most on tool control. I think way too many people veer off of spindle turning too quickly and go into bowl making and stuff like that, and they have a hard time progressing past that without a lot of effort because they don't have that foundation tool control that spindle turning does. And if you want to be a professional wood turner, which I do not consider myself one, spindle turning is where the money's going to be at, because you have designers that come up, they want to have an entire series of chairs for selling in furniture stores. They need 200 chairs, there's 800 legs, you know, you got the in between the legs, the stretchers and stuff like that. Well, if you want the best of the best, you're not going to be able to duplicate that on a CNC machine, because there's just stuff that a straight blade cutting wood can do that a round bit can't. And there's a crispness, a liveliness to really good quality spindles turned by somebody with a lot of skill. But from there, a lot of people will progress into bowl turning. And bowl turning is something, if you're in a side hustle, it's a great way to make a little extra income, because the material is free. You can just go out and get it. You can actually dry it yourself. And honestly, there's only so many cuts, so many shapes you can do in bowl turning. Well, I say shapes. There's infinite number of shapes. And there's people like Glenn Lucas that spend an entire career refining shapes so that they can make them in the least amount of cuts and get the highest quality consumable item that people want, and they'll wholesale them out there, and they make brilliant careers out of that one. But after a while, it's still a shape, and people, after they get somewhat bored making them, they venture into the, you know, cosmetics of it, the embellishment, and there's a wild different options you can go there. But in the end, it's a bowl, and you can sell them at places around town like farmers markets, art markets. You can make a decent amount of income, but it is a bowl. Boxes, on the other hand, boxes are what we use to protect our most valuable and prized possessions. Anything from oatmeal to diamonds, or something in between like a little salt pinch. Boxes are what we use to surround what we hold as value. And if you've ever gone to something like an instant gallery or a museum or something like on, and they have a display on wood turning, it seems like the variations in boxes and what you can do with them is infinite. I could see spending an entire career making nothing but boxes and never learning all the possibilities. I mean, okay, you might not be able to tell this, but boxes are where it's at for me. Now, saying on that, you don't have to have a great design sense or ultimate tool control to make a very precise box. In fact, that's what today's lesson is going to be about. The first boxes I always encourage people to make are acorn boxes. Now, I say the acorn is the best project to begin learning to make boxes on the lathe, because it takes away a lot of the stuff that new wood turners are apprehensive about. Design-wise, you really cannot screw up an acorn. If the cap is too big or too small, no big deal. There's a tree of oak out there that makes an acorn like that. Same way with the nuts shell. If it's too thin, too long, too big, whatever, it doesn't matter. They are all good. They will all function. And as far as utility, if you have any women in your family, this is a great gift to display your skill level, especially in the holidays. You have a dozen ladies in your family, a Saturday or a weekend spent in the shop, you can make them all an acorn box, because, well, times might have changed, but in my day, a lot of ladies would carry like a band-aid for the backs of the heels if it rubs in too much. They'd have a safety pin for a button repair, needles, an extra $20 bill, some Advil, just whatever to fit in here. And because they change out of bags so often, yes, I'm stereotyping, having one place for all those emergency items in their bag that they can just reach in and find by feel, and they can transfer from one bag to the other, that's just great. And shoot, guys like me, I carry a bag quite often, whether it's be on a motorcycle where I like a backpack, or just a satchel. And inside mine, you know, I carry some earphones, a USB card, maybe even a charger, some SD cards, an extra $20 bill, whatever. It's just easy to transfer around with those emergency supplies. So everybody has a function for a box this size, as long as it will stay together, can fit in your hand, and will be durable inside a bag getting banged around and stuff like that. So designs and functions, they have that purpose, and you don't have to worry about the other. And you can use just scrap wood around the shop. Doesn't even have to be the same species. So I do recommend, if you're doing multiple species, stick to a dark color on top and the lighter color for the base. Now, in my mind, an Acorn box is a great beginner level project, but when I say beginner, I'm going to qualify that a little bit. I'm going to say a beginner with experience. And if you haven't seen some of my previous videos, specifically that one on the 4 cuts, which I talk a lot about tool control and what's happening with the cutting edges and grain, that'd be a great, better place to start out on. From there, you maybe venture into Turn My First Bowl, where it's not so much about bowl turning as I go more into detail on the basic tools that you're going to need to get involved in this craft. And I talk a little bit about tool control and grain direction, some real basics. I also have a really old video I call Wood Turning Demystified that talks a lot about the physics of the craft, and you'll gain a lot of understanding from that. If you actually peruse those, you'll get a lot more out of this video. But if you haven't seen them, don't worry about it. I'm going to be giving a lot of tips and tricks. Just understand, I'm going to kind of gloss over some things I've covered in those other videos. So real quickly, let's talk about what tools I'm going to be using. Obviously the lathe, I'm going to be using a chuck, and yes, I do have a video talking about chucks and all the different jaws and what features of jaws you want and stuff like that. But that's what's going to be holding our work. And we are actually going to be starting between centers with just a random block of wood. And the tools I'm going to be using are just your standard set of tools you see me use in a lot of the other videos. This is a 3/8 inch spindle gouge with a fingernail grind on it. It's a Thompson tool blade. I also will be using a skew. Doesn't really matter what size you use. I like this shape, and I'll go into that in detail later on. We are going to be using 2 different scrapers, a round nose and a square that isn't really square. Again, I'll be talking about that later. I'll be starting out with a spindle roughing gouge, a tool that's only used on spindles, not bowls or end grain hollowing. And I tend to use 2 parting tools. If you only can get one like this. I think that's a 1/4 inch. This is just because I tend to use up small pieces of wood. I use it all the way close, and sometimes parting out a little bit. This thinner one allows me to use less wood. And finally, a depth gauge or a depth tool. Basically all this is a drill bit that I made a handle for. And sharpening is just as important as what tools you're using. When I'm making these acorns, I'm typically making 6 to a dozen at a time, because hey, if you're gonna make one, you might as well make a couple. And you know, your first acorn, it might take you 2 hours to make. Your second one, maybe an hour. And if you keep batching them out, you're going to find that in a natural pace, you could probably make one in 10 to 15 minutes. It's not that big a deal. I mean, completely to adding finishing to them in that time. But one of the steps into doing those kind of speedy jobs is having your sharpening set up for this particular project. And what I would do is I will set up my Wolverine setup so that my spindle gouge can be sharpened with the attachment right there. Just pop it in, set the depth, get back to work. And I set up a platform for all my scrapers, because you are doing a little bit of scraping when you're hollowing these out and shaping the tenons. And if you saw my fork cuts video, you understand a high-speed steel scraper, the ones I'm using from Thompson, the burr only lasts maybe 10 to 30 seconds for each little kind of millimeter on there. You'll be able to get a acorn done before having to come back and sharpen your scrapers, and it takes 5-10 seconds. In fact, I'll show you. I use 2 scrapers, and both of these have a rough burr. You can control the types of burrs you have, but a rough burr in my mind is just straight off of a grinder. And for both of these, they're set up to use this platform at this angle, and basically I have this platform. It's set here for all my scrapers. Come over, turn it on. If I want to add a burr on this one, I'll start on one side. And that's all there is to it. The secret with the round nose is that kind of dips a little bit on this side, and the peak is, maybe a 1/8 of an inch over, and then it comes over here. This exact curve, not that big a deal, just as long as it's diminishing or expanding or whatever that is. But I now have a working burr that do some hollowing. The other thing is the square scraper. And if you notice, this is perpendicular 90 degrees. What's really strange about square scrapers is it's easier to get a perfect square if the scraper itself is not perfectly square. It's actually at a slight angle, and that angle doesn't really matter too much, a couple of degrees. And I just sit it right there, move it back around, and there we go. I have a nice burr all the way across. I need a little more right there, so I will just kind of push a little bit more on that side. And there we go. I have the burr I want. But I also want you to notice something else. I turn away the heel on all of these, and I'll explain why later on. But how I do that one is I'll raise it up a little bit, and I just kind of start it and turn it up. Turn it up. And I do that one until it doesn't quite come up to the point right there and all of this metal is gone. I do the same exact thing with my round nose. I turn away all this heel. And you understand why later on. Now, I say that box making is kind of the pinnacle of the craft because every single aspect of it you have to take extreme consideration, even the material selection and how it was dried. I mean, you can turn a dead green bowl straight from a tree, chop down a tree, turn a bowl that very day. Yes, it's going to warp, but if you turn it properly with the idea that it will need to warp, no big deal. Now, if it warps a little or a lot, it's still going to be a bowl. It's still going to hold your cereal. Somewhat true with a spindle. You're turning a spindle for a chair leg. As long as the 2 Mortises are in the end, if it moves a little bit in the middle, nobody's really going to know. You make a huge banister full of spindles. If one is a 1/2 millimeter moved over or bent a little bit, the curves of the piece will hide it. Not so much with a box. If a box moves even so slightly, that lid will not fit right, or it will be locked on for good and you'll never get it off, or it'll be so loose that it'll fall apart all the time. And sometimes that is something you want with a box, but that's all stuff you have to take into consideration. And the speed at which it's dried is also important, because I have a piece of pecan right here. It was air dried for probably 3 years, and then I stuck it in my freezer kiln with a light bulb to really heat it up high to kill any bugs or anything like that, or funguses. And then I let it acclimate for another 3 or 4 months. So with just the general rule of thumb is, if you're air drying stuff, it's 1 inch per inch of the material plus a year. So this right here, roughly 3 inches or 12 quarters, and you know, I've had it in my shop for 4 or 5 years. So even if it was just air drying and I hadn't stuck it in the kiln at that last little step, it's ready to rock and roll. If you are buying wood from the lumber store, you know, that tree might have been felled. You know, they cut it 12 quarter, 16 quarter, big enough sizes that we can make a decent box. You know, they might have only air dried it for a few months and then just blasted it with a kiln, so it still might be moving. So if you buy lumber, you still need to let it sit around for a year or two in your shop to get it acclimated so that it will work properly. Now, there are ways to rough turn grain lumber. Richard Rapin has a book on it, and I'll put a link in the description of it. Let me show it to you. This is what it looks like, the original publishing. I think he has a new cover out now. But Richard Rapin is probably the best at teaching box making basics that I know of. Very, very good. He has a couple DVDs out there. And in the book, he tells you how to, you know, cut down the tree and then rough out boxes so that they're only about a 1/2 inch to inch thick. And then you can dry that fairly quickly, you know, 4 months, 6 months, and have something ready to rock and roll. But understand, you kind of have to pick out what design box you're going to be doing before you rough it out. And me personally, I'm not that good. I don't think that far ahead. So, you know, you have a bunch of these scraps lying around your shop. You'll be surprised at how fast 4 or 5 years goes past. You have a lot of other projects you can learn on. And then you'll end up with a bunch of box material ready to rock and roll by the time you're ready to make boxes. And as long as you keep replenishing what you use, it'll be there when you want to turn something. I mean, most of us are not making thousands of boxes a year, maybe a couple dozen. Anyways, I have this pecan. It is really fairly straight grained, and it's fully dried. 3 inches across, maybe 12 inches long to make 1 acorn. So, first step, let's get this ready to chuck up and make a round. Okay, that was roughing it out to a roundness, and in that situation I use my spindle roughing gouge. This is the only time I'm going to use this tool, because in this situation the tree was laying on its side and it was rotating it around. That's the ideal position, ideal use of the spindle roughing gouge. Any other application on this project, this would be a dangerous tool, so it gets put away at this point in time. From here, what you're going to see me do is I'm going to put 2 tenons on either end, and what I'm doing is I'm lining them up to this thickness right here. That's one of the advantages of using a insert for your drive spur into a chuck, is because it separates out your chuck just about the right size so that you can eyeball the thickness of the tenon that you're going to be doing. You're then going to see me cut off a little bit on the end and add another tenon, so I end up with 2 pieces with the tenon on each side. This becomes an extra cap that I'll use on the last step. Now I am about to divide this up, and the reason why is basically when we're making these acorns, if you're making it out of a solid piece of wood, the idea is you kind of want all the grain to line up so it just looks cool. You can get more bragging rights and it impresses the customers a little bit. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to turn the cap first of the acorn, and then we're going to do the nut side second. So by having this tenon right here, if I divide it down the center, whenever I turn the nut, I can reverse it to hollow it out and do all the shaping and stuff like that. So the idea right now is we need to now divide this up. Now if you have an excess of wood like we do right now, if you divide it in the center, you're pretty much going to be okay, because the base of it isn't going to be that big. But if you're really scrapping for lumber, like a lot of times I would do, you kind of want to divide it up, the design up, into 5 sections, where the top 2 sections will be the cap, the bottom 3 sections will be the nut, and then 1/5 of it will be a tenon. So you're actually getting an extra 1/5 of the 2 parts that merge together. Now this piece is a bit thick to divide all in one pass. So a lot of times when I'm doing this one, I will go touch up my divider, and by coming straight off the grinder, you get a little burr on both sides, and that burr will give you a little bit of motion. You'll also see I will either take 2 passes where I come over a tad bit, or you'll see me wiggling it, and that wiggling it will allow the side of this to cut its way down to make a little bit more of a gap. What you don't want to do is just plunge down all the way to the center, because eventually it's going to bind up on both sides. And most of the time I will leave about a 1/4 inch stub in the middle, for the simple reason that I find it much safer to cut that last little bit with either the saw or my bandsaw. So I'll come back up, just take a little bit more off the side, just so that my tool doesn't bind up, and give it a little wiggle as I go down. Now understand, I make a lot of these at once, maybe a dozen at a time. So I get them all to this stage so I can then go separate them all out in the bandsaw, and I will leave them stacked up in order so that they stay matching for the whole dozen. And then you spend the rest of the day turning the rest of them out. But for this demonstration, I'm just doing the one at a time. So here's the cap of the nut, and the very first thing we want to do is create this first curve right here, because that's going to not only set the width of the entire mortise that we're creating, but if you only do the first curve and you screw up, you can just come back a little bit and make it redo this. If you go ahead and do this entire curve right here, you can't back it up. So anticipate that you are going to screw up, especially in the beginning, and we're just going to round this one section off right here, making this the total outside diameter we are using. And that was a very long description just to explain this one cut right here. I touch, I lift till I see shavings, and I roll it over. That's it. If you don't like the shape, you can come back. I'm so used to doing ones that are slightly smaller, I'm going to create a gentler curve on this one right here, just because it is a little bit bigger than I normally do. That's it right there. Next up, we are going to be creating this flat right here, and that's where the shell of the nut is going to rest. And it's incredibly important that we get enough room here so that the shell will rest below that curve, and I'll show you why it looks odd if you have any kind of gap there later on. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to position the height of my tool rest so that my square scraper with that fresh burr right there, you know, this right here is horizontal. I want to actually have to tilt it down a little bit to engage that burr, and I want to make sure that I'm touching the wood ever so slightly above center. The reason why is the torque action is now going slightly this way. It's not going straight down where I engage it. It's kind of coming off at this slight angle right there. That way I can put a little bit of pressure right here, because the blade is the wood is kind of pushing it a little bit this way, and I can gain control. If I get it slightly below that, there's a chance the wood is actually going to want to drag it slowly, and now I'm controlling at the back of the handle pressure this way. It's a very minute difference, but it will enhance the control of the cut you have. And once again, that was a long explanation for just doing this. Putting my finger on this side, a little weight on the top, coming over and just pressing it in and making sure it is dead flat. There we go. And notice, because we were cutting straight into ingrain, with that scraping action, we've got a pretty smooth finish there. Next up, we're going to hollow out the inside of the cone, and we're going to add any decoration we want to it. Now this is going to set the depth of our top, and that is important because remember, the mortise is going to come into the top a little bit, so this dome right here, if anybody overstuffs the acorn, that's where that overstuffing area is going to go. And me personally, I just like a little bit of features on the inside if you can get it. So here's how we're going to create this entire section. The first part is getting rid of most of this waste. Now acorn is not that much material, so in this situation I'm just going to scrape most of the way. Now right now I have my tool rest set for that square scraper doing this edge right here, but if you notice, I want to engage it right in the middle this time, and it's a little bit high with the thickness of this scraper. And having a thick scraper means that you are not going to have as much vibration, which will give you a better cut and more control. So I like the thickness of these Thompson steel blades. So right now I can touch the center of it. Notice that the burr is slightly cutting now. If I raise it up, it's not so much cutting. I lower it down, you're going to get more shavings coming off. Also notice that because of that slightly curved back on that one section right there, I can press in. I'm actually pressing in on the center right here, not necessarily right there. And basically it's just a little slight press. The wood is not moving very quickly in the center, and as you move across the side, the material comes off. Press. Not much weight, move over. Now I'm going to do something right here that is going to be beneficial later on. I'm going to create this nib in the center. It's a very common thing. And a lot of people, when they're making boxes, they want to get rid of that nib. They think it's ugly, okay? But it's hard for me to find that nib when it's blind. So what I would do is I will take my scraper and keeping it dead parallel so it's not cutting, I can actually push forward till I feel the nib. Pretend this is blind way on the inside of the bowl. I can feel the nib. If I lower it down, once I don't feel it anymore, I can move forward ever so slightly and come up. And that burr will cut it off a little bit at a time until I get it going, and I can hear the difference. And then on the last cut on the inside, I start below, I come up, and as I'm scraping it, I kind of come up towards the top like that. And now that last cut, the nib is pretty much going to be gone. A little bit left right there, so I can start, I touch it, or I can feel it, I come down below, I start scraping, and I move up into it and then move past it. And there you go. So now the nib is so diminished that a little bit of sandpaper would take care of it. Eventually you get it so you can feel where it's at. But that nib is everybody seems to hate it. Totally gone, it's dead smooth. All you're seeing right now is the grain rings. Okay, so I'm going to continue removing some material, but I'm not going to come over to this edge any farther. Press, and I'm just removing weight and adding the dome. Now I'm going to raise my tool rest up a little bit because I'm returning to my square to create the shoulders. And when I'm creating the shoulder, I'm going to come up even farther on the edge. Now, this is the exact reason why I removed that edge right there. Because if you look at this thickness I have on the blade, if I didn't have that removed, basically that thickness would be bumping into the side and I couldn't create a square shoulder because this non-cutting portion of the blade would shove me over. But the fact that it is no longer there, I can now push into the wood and the bottom edge isn't going to ride on it. That's also why you saw me cut it non-square, because this tip is actually farther inside than this one. So I can now press it straight in, and then if I want to square at the bottom, I just yank it over a little bit. By having that slight point right there allows me to get that straight shoulder. Now this Acorn box uses a mortise and tenon joint, and right now this recess we're creating is going to be the mortise. So we are in effect making the most critical cut of the entire project right now. And I went into a very in-depth talk on the mortise and tenon joint in turning and my technique of having a dead square mortise but a round tenon to enable a quality fit, get an airtight seal, and make it tight enough that it's not going to come apart unless you physically take it apart. And that entire joint's success depended upon having a mortise that was exactly parallel to the face. And that is one of the hardest things to do. So here's my trick for doing it. It's not depending upon your eyes to get that mortise. It's using the bed rails. Look right here. If I were to come in and if I was focusing on this 90 degrees with the tool rest here, well, my tool rest could be off. It could be different from the face right there. So, you know, that might not be a perfect square shoulder on the end product just because I'm square right here. What I will do, because my lathe is square with the bed rails, I will try to create a parallel line between my tool and the the rails below. And basically moving my head over slightly so I can line everything up. Holding this right here, I can then just press it in to create the perfectly square shoulder. And that is critical. Now that's all lined up. All I'm doing now is focusing on the depth I want my mortise. And I want a good amount of tenon to fit in there. And the last thing I would do, normally this is all one shot, but I don't have any way to put the wood back on to do it, is I'll kick my handle out a little bit. And what that does is it shoves the tip into the corner a little bit, so that corner is a little bit more recessed and it flattens out the face. So I now have the mortise shaped, most of the meat of my tenon, of the top of the mushroom gone, and now I can add a little decoration. And this is probably not advisable for everybody, but I'll use the tip of my skew as a scraper and I'll just add some lines. No big deal. If you don't like the lines, you don't have to add them yourself. So from here, just reset your tool rest back into the spindle turning mode. Now I'm going to be using my spindle gouge, so I get it to the height that I prefer for my spindle gouge. Find a pencil. I'll use the eraser side. I'll go to the center. I kind of put my finger where I can see it lining up, and that tells me where I need to make the maximum shape of my cap can go without blowing out the center right here. So I'm right there. And then it's just a matter of shaping the top of your acorn the way you want. Personally, I will come over here and just start removing material so I can go deeper and deeper each time. Knowing that that's going to be the top right there, kind of eyeballing it. And then I will continue this curve that I started here. I'll just try and blend it so it's smooth. Now some people might leave a slight flat on top that they can handle with their sandpaper, but if you're brave, just go for the smoothness you can get. A gentle curve in nature, no spikes, no highlights, And if you do it right, you shouldn't see any shadows whatsoever. You can see my high spot, and that's barely feelable right there, but because I have a raking light coming onto it, it really shows up on this right here. And from there, just start removing material until you can get to roughly the thickness of the stem. Now at the same time as I'm making my shapes I like, I'm also feeling for the thickness of the dome, because I want that to be, you know, maybe that close, because I don't want this to be too heavy a box. So if you're finding it's too short, you can always take off a little bit here and change your curves. If it's too much, well, yeah, you're going to blow it out once you put the stem on. But I'll leave about this much on, and then I'm going to sand the entire outside, sand the inside. And when you're sanding it, I really only, on the interior, I'll do, you know, maybe 180, 220 in there. I'm just concerned about getting scratches out on the inside, because that's always going to be beat up. But on the outside, I will finish sand just a little bit over this curve right here. Don't worry about any of the top. Just get the top of the curve as smooth as you want. Now, finish is always kind of a touchy subject. Here's my opinion. This particular project is something that's going to be held in your hand. It's going to be used and abused. It's going to be next to car keys and bags, all that kind of stuff. I would rather it feel really good and maintain its finish than be glossy smooth. In fact, I don't even like a film finish on this kind of stuff because it will show scratches more. Whereas a simple oil and wax finish is easy to apply, that my customers can easily buff it up with a shoe shine brush that will bring the wax back up to a shine, or if it's looking dull, they can put oil on it. But I've also found that, you know, fingernail scratching and stuff like that, the natural oils in their skin or just rubbing around on it will kind of fill them and the scratches will somewhat disappear. So an oil and wax finish is just fine for me. I've got my magic whoopee right here. Warning, stick to specific species right there. If you use like a lot of boat art, this will kind of go yellow, you know, part of yellow finish here. Or if you do a lot of walnut, it'll darken it up. But just turn on the lathe, a little bit of oil to replenish it. Make sure you get enough so the oil will seep into any crevices or anything like that, any corners. And we are just doing the interior and this little lip. That's it. The rest we are going to handle later. And then the secret sauce, a little bit beeswax. And I'll tell you, if you're doing a bunch of these, what happens is you'll put wax on the first few of them, and then your rag itself will get impregnated with the wax, so you won't have to do that as much. Turn up the speed, melt the wax in. The wax should melt into the top layer of the wood and form somewhat of a watertight seal. The rag will soak up any excess oil. The heat will somewhat cure the walnut oil. And there we go. And it should be pretty warm but dry to the touch by now. Looking pretty. From here, I will use my parting gouge to just peel away a lot of weight. Now understand, this curve is going to continue on down, so you don't want to damage any part of the wood that's going to be part that you want to keep. But you can remove as much waste as you feel comfortable down to where the stem of the acorn will be. And then just take the whole thing off. And you end up with a totally finished interior, a straight mortise, and a rough cap. Now it might not feel like it to you, but you have now completed the most technical part of the entire project. The rest of it, you're just winging it. So you take that bottom half that we cut off, put that in your chuck, can turn it on, but pretty much it is going to be really balanced. There you go. The face is pretty square for me, so I will kind of eyeball this mortise, looking for the close to the depth I want. And we're now going to start creating the tenon, and I will do that with my skew. Now this is where I like the shape of my skew, how I do it. If you notice, from about right here to about right there is pretty much dead flat. And then I have this curve right here. Connecting these 2 points creates my 70 degrees, but this is fairly straight. Now I know a lot of people that will take it and go completely straight across at 90 degrees here and then curve it down, but having it at this slight angle is kind of the same reason why I do my square scraper at this slight angle. Because if I were to come in at a perfect 90 degrees, oftentimes you're doing that one, the tip is a little bit farther in, so it creates a slight dovetail. You can't do that one if it's straight across. So what I'm going to do is, once again, kind of eyeball where the section is, where it needs to come. I'm going to come down to that 2/3 of the way. And I'm only taking off a little bit. Come over here, eyeball it. I'm way, way off. A little bit more. Now, if you go blow past it at this point in time, just take that off and start over again. Or leave it on and come down to that line plus a little bit. Use whatever your screw up as an aid for the next step. Right now, it's still a little bit too big. Now, fitting tops is the most frustrating aspect, so this is a good skill to learn to do. As you get closer, you're going to find that your cap it won't fit on there, obviously right now, but it'll fit over the bottom section. So if you can kind of slide it over the bottom section and then rotate it up, wherever it touches right there, that's going to be closer to your end goal. So a lot of times towards the end, you'll see me, I'll kind of rock it forward, and the closer I get to it, the closer this gap will come down. Now right now, I am still doing a peeling cut coming down. And you can see, now my skew is slightly angled this way to get this completely flat. So I come down and I do a peeling cut. I'll stop it, check it off. See, now it is super close. You see that gap is almost non-existent, but it still will barely go on. So at this point in time, I'm going to take my skew from this being flat, I'm going to angle it over a little bit so that now the point's going to come in, and now I'm going to make that bottom section. I'm going to bring this down so that the cutting line just disappears. And what just happened was now this shoulder right here is slightly lower than right there. And yet my top will still not fit on. I'm in essence creating a curve, and right where that is right now, that's a high spot of the curve. So if I wasn't very brave, I could now start using sandpaper to remove that ever so slightly bit, or instead of making a peeling cut from the top, I can now start coming in straight from the side so that this face is negative and scraping the top of that curve a little bit. And it's easy to go too far on this. So you can see where the shavings are coming off on the blade as to where I'm touching. I'm just ever so slightly easing it and then rolling around that curve to get it. And I might have just blown past it right there. We'll see. Top it off. A little bit deeper. So let's make this section right here shallower, but not touch this section right here. And you look at the shavings to figure out where on it you're cutting, because my eyesight is not good, so I can't always tell. See? I'm just going to remove a little bit of this right here, just to get it out of the way. so I can get in here a little bit more. Tad bit more from the top of the hump. Now it's getting on there and it's a little bit too tight, so you can see the top of the hump right there, but notice that wax I put on this right here, it's now showing me where it's touching. So if I press on it, I can see that wax telling me where the high spots are. And at this point in time, I'm just going to use sandpaper to get whatever fine stuff I do. I just aim for wherever the wax showed me. Just sand it down. And fit it. And there we go. A nice, tight, almost a tad bit too tight fit, which is what we want right now. Now, if you remember, we have sanded all the way over here and we've just put wax on this interior section right there. So all this is raw wood, but we are done with it. All we're concerned with is this back section right here. And this is what's called a jamb chuck. It's just being held on there with friction. The downside is if we had to do any work over here, the wedging action of our tool working against it would actually pry this off. But since we're now working on this direction, we can use the bevel pressure to press back this way. Or if we are cutting, we can press into it. So none of our torque of actually cutting on this device is actually going to be pulling it off of that jamb chuck. You just don't want to get too aggressive on it, especially at the very start of your cut, until you can get that bevel pressing back against it for the pressure. And just shape the stem of your acorn however you want. Don't make it too thin, otherwise it will pop off. Finish is the same, just a couple drops of oil. And once again, after you've used your rag enough, you don't really have to reapply the wax because it's completely saturated into the rag. The way you get it from the rag onto the piece is to crank up the speed of the lathe so it will melt off of the rag into the wood. And the speed will cure the oil, or most of the way. You get a nice looking cap. Now I did these samples for y'all because I wanted y'all to see the shape, and walnut kind of hides a lot of stuff. It's just a dark shape. And I want you to notice there's a little cap right here. See, when an acorn grows, the cap kind of grows on the outside, and this acorn actually continues up inside there. So whenever you're creating these, remember I told you how important it was to get that flat right there so it was lower, it was wider than what your acorn shell would be. So even if the flat shows and it's too big, it still looks good as an acorn. But then you look at this one right here, and what draws my eye to it is you see that real shadow line right there. That's what looks odd with this. And this is the case where the cap, the shoulder of the cap actually came close inside this. So the shell is going on the outside. I didn't make the shoulder wide enough so that y'all could see the difference. What we're talking about is this flat right here needs to be narrower than where this edge is touching it to create a shape that is going to look right when it's closed. It'll look like the shell is going up inside the cap. So notice on our example right now, this is the outside of the shell, and notice it is higher than the flat spot on our cap. So it looks like it's going over on the outside instead coming on the inside. So we now need to lower this just enough so it's going to fit inside of that cap right there. And a lot of times you'll see a little wax right here from this right here, but it's not showing there. So real quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my skew to plane that down until this fits underneath the cap. And it's not going to take much, because you can use the 10-inch shoulder as a gauge and kind of eyeball it a little bit. Let's get it turning the right way. Come down a little bit. Now, I will say this being the inside of the shell, I kind of like it to dive in a little bit so it looks like the nut is curving in. I don't want it going straight. So when I'm doing my skew on this, I've kind of got it angled, so now I'm planing and it's going to kind of angle in a little bit. Just like that. Stop it and check it to see how it is. And now that, see, now it fits right underneath the cap, and that extra leverage right there makes the cap something easy to get on and off, because you now have something to grab onto. So believe it or not, this section right here, we're pretty much done with the shell. The rest of it is just shaping the shell roughly at this stage. And you can use any tool you want. I just prefer the skew and a peeling cut because I find it so fast. Just roughing out the rough shape of an egg. And the last cut before hollowing is somewhat of a peeling cut, but my goal is to create a slight recess right there. That recess is to make sure that my depth gauge, this little drill bit in a handle, will center itself. If it's on a flat surface, it could skid around. That little recess just keeps it aligned in the middle. And you notice my handle has these flats on it, so I can grab it, and in case it torques a little bit, I have a little bit of power with it. So, to find out how deep I want to go, I just eyeball it. Make sure the speed is down. Kind of put your finger about as deep as you want to go right there, and that's your depth gauge. If you want to put some blue tape, you can. And then just kind of align it and do your best to hold it parallel to the bed. And just press forward. I'm not quite parallel, so it's going in circles like that. Just pull it out to clear out the shavings. And when you reach your desired depth, there you go. Now all you have to do is hollow it out until that hole goes away. Now I like to use my spindle gouge to get rid of most of the meat of this hollowing section. And to use it, you have to have a lot of faith in the idea of the supported cut. And I really go into depth in this in the 4 cuts video. But the idea is, whenever I put this tool on the tool rest, if I'm completely open right now where the 2 flutes are level, well, the bottom of my gouge right there is the only part of this tool that is supported on the tool rest, because the sides are now hovering above the tool rest. If any pressure goes on either side, it wants to torque my tool around. But I can press as hard as I want in the center, and because it is right above where the tool rest is, it's not going anywhere. Now, very rarely do you ever use a spindle gouge off the very tip. It's always off one of the sides or the other. And on this case, I'm going to be cutting over on this side, so I'm cutting over here. So I'm going to rotate my tool ever so slightly. So now the supported part of the blade is right over here. And since I want to cut more towards the tip and not on this very side, if I were to move my back of the handle of my tool blade over a little bit, now I'm still cutting on this supported edge, which is off the center, and I'd be cutting on the side of the wall. So if you look at me when I do these, I actually start with the tool somewhat flat. I bring it, close it ever so slightly. I touch the side of the wall, and as I start cutting, I move my back handle over this way so it comes around, and I cut right off the tip right there all along this wall. If I hadn't brought my tool around, it would slowly climb up this wing right here, and eventually it'd want to torque my tool over and I'd get a nasty catch. So here we go. Go ahead, turn the speed up. I kind of plunge it in somewhat straight into that hole. I turn my tool rest around and I drag it out. I'm trying to do it so my hand's not in the way. And if at all possible, I want you to pay attention where the shavings are coming across the edge until it goes totally blind. And normally this is just a few cuts, but I'm trying to go slow to show you what the cut is. See, it's coming off right off center off the tip because the heel of my handle is kicked out to the side. See how I'm doing that? And if you look at the shavings, this is actually a slicing cut. I'm actually going with the grain. It's very easy. So keep plunging and pulling. Right now, I cannot see the cutting edge. I'm just doing it based on feel. Now you hear it click, 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 click right now. That's because I didn't have that heel far enough over, so this wing over here was starting to touch and it would want to torque it around. So the deeper you go, the farther that heel of the handle you need to get turned around. Now hopefully as I blow out the shavings, you'll see we're getting closer and closer and closer to getting rid of that hole. Now I won't use my spindle gouge to get rid of all of it. I will leave a little bit for the last little bit of scraping because I find that hole right there helps out in not getting that little nib I talked about earlier. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the scraper. Now, unfortunately, at this point in time, this is going to be a totally blind cut. I basically have to go off of the feel I had when I was doing the cap where I could actually see it. So I want to get it aligned up so that when I'm this far deep, I'm at a slight decline so that the burr will be engaging, and I know where on this tip that I'm going to be touching. And you kind of know where along this tip you're going to be touching based upon the angle you are attacking the interior. You're kind of just visualizing inside because there's no way you're going to actually see. So I'm going to come in. I'm a little bit high right now. You can see I'm angled down quite a bit. I'll lower it just a tad. Then I'm going to plunge straight in, knowing that there's a slight recess there, so that tip right there is going to touch in that recess, so that it's going to start cutting right off of the center right there. Make sure I'm not angled at all. I'm not rocking, in other words. I'm completely flat on the tool rest. And just come in, go in slow. You hear it? I'm now touching on that center because it's moving very slow in the center. It's not cutting. I move it out to the side. All of a sudden I see shavings, and I don't want the entire wing on the side, so there we go. One more time, starting on the bottom, and I don't know if you can tell, I'm going to lift up, so I'm riding up in the center to get rid of the nub. think I still felt it riding up. Get rid of the nub. Blow it out and take a good look. Now, if you don't have an air gun, you can always use a bendy straw and do the same thing. Just use your breath. And there you go. A fairly smooth finish. It actually kind of flares out a little bit, and then there's no nub on the center. So when somebody looks in it, or they stick their finger in it, it'll be worthwhile surface. Now we know that interior curve is going to be just ever so slightly bigger than this right here because we're working our way around. So we can kind of gauge what the curve is going to be here. So if once again you use your pencil as a depth stop, you drop it in, you line your fingers up, you can kind of tell, okay, that is the very bottom of my box. If I go any shallower than that, I'm now going to get a hole. So I need to end my box right on that other side. So all you're going to be doing is shaping and sanding, and your box is pretty much done. And my technique for that is pretty much exactly the same as when I was working on the cap. I just create a curve, I kind of eyeball where I want the bottoms to be. I make sure I line up this front curve with a back curve as smoothly as I possibly can. Only this time I don't have to worry about the stem. So I will get the shape close to what I want, and then I'll use my fingers. And you can't really tell the thickness by this way, but as you move down and across, you can kind of tell your fingers are going wider and closer together. So I have a real hump right there that I don't like because that's just added weight for the box. So without diminishing the dive on this first portion right here, I'm going to remove a little bit of that material for this one particular box. Flatten that out and then transition it into the base. Now when you sand the interior, they tell you never to stick your fingers in. This is a pretty big gap, but if your sandpaper grips and your finger doesn't have any room, it can literally twist your finger off. So they recommend never doing what I'm about to do, and that's sticking your finger in the hole to sand out the interior. But hey, I'm doing it. Now when you're sanding the exterior, you don't really need to worry about this tip right there, because just like with the cap, we're going to reverse this, put it in a Jamb Chuck, except that Jamb Chuck is now going to be a mortise in order to turn off the bottom. So just sand what you need to. We are going to finish the interior though. And by finish the interior, I mean drop a few things of oil in there and shove your oil and beeswax rag inside there and then crank up the speed. Part it off and then make sure you don't take off too much wood. So now we have a nice little box. And now I want you to think back, way back a half hour ago when we started this video. Remember when we cut off that one end and it had a tenon already on it? Just like that little piece. Well, this is now the Jamb Chuck we're going to use to finish off the bottom of the acorn. line up the grain pattern and look for that click. There we go. A little acorn box. Listen, I hope that you realize after watching this full video where I went into details of the entire project that this really is something within the realm of a beginner with a little bit of experience. Maybe you've done a little spindle turning, made a bowl or two, you've gone to a club meeting and had a more experienced turner talk to you about supported cuts, riding the bevel, gliding the bevel, how to sharpen, and all that kind of stuff. Well, nothing I did here was overly technical other than that mortise and tenon joint. Nothing was critical other than that mortise and tenon joint. And it might be finicky, but it's within your realm of expertise. This is the perfect launching for that entire category of turning that I love so much, box making. From here, options are endless. And I hope you're willing to get out in the shop and try it yourself. Get out there, be safe, have fun. Hey, visit my website, wortheffort.com, where I have a lot of swag, t-shirts, hats, and stuff like that. That's the kind of support that allows me to do these long form videos. And remember, after everything, that it is always worth the effort to learn, create, share with others. Be safe, have fun.